Villains. You love them, I love them, but how do you write the perfect villain? Well, I've boiled down what I believe to be the answer into 3 major checkboxes that every esteemed antagonist will have no problem checking off. And what better character to exemplify this than J.K. Simmons' second greatest role as Fletcher from Whiplash. The first obviously being J. Jonah Jameson. Alongside the brilliant score and cinematography, Fletcher is easily the most memorable aspect of Damien Chazelle's directorial debut. And I believe that has a lot to do with him passing checkbox 1 with flying colors, that being threat level. It sort of goes without saying, but a large responsibility of a villain is keeping the plot engaging via sufficient rising action. And if your antagonist is constantly putting the protagonist's goals or even lives in jeopardy, you've usually accomplished that. Every so often though, a villain will just completely fumble the stakes, making for a narrative that the audience has no investment in at all. Now alongside Fletcher, I'll be presenting a good and bad example from other films just so we can have some additional perspective and appreciation for the main man. In this case, Thanos is probably one of the better modern examples of a villain that succeeds in getting the audience to truly fear him. First off, bald people do tend to be kind of scary, and secondly, his goal has massive repercussions. Since the guy's so powerful, it adds this ticking clock effect, giving actual urgency to the plot and convincing the audience that he genuinely could win, which he literally does. On the opposite side of the spectrum, you've got Rocky V's Tommy Gunn. Tommy's merely a plot device to direct the blame of Rocky's poor decisions at, and to add insult to injury, the poor kid gets absolutely thrashed in a back alley for what this movie calls a climactic final fight. It's a joke of a villain in a joke of a movie. So what does big man Terrence do that makes him so darn intimidating? Is it because he yells and curses? Well, yes and no. The brilliant thing about Fletcher is that he's super passive aggressive. One minute he's reassuring Andrew that he deserves to be there, and the next he's throwing chairs. It's because of this two-faced act that Fletcher is so darn unpredictable, and that enigmatic nature bleeds its way into the tone of every scene. Whenever he walks into a room, you don't know what to expect, so you just sit on the edge of your seat, anxiously praying that Neiman makes out of rehearsal alive. And when those terrifying moments you were anticipating finally occur, they're like 10 times worse than whatever you imagined.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Rushing or dragging?
Rushing.
So you do know the difference!
Damien Chazelle, you sick man for coming up with this form of torture. I first watched this movie in my junior year of high school because a good friend of mine thought it would be funny to recommend Whiplash to someone just getting into drumming. But my drumming teacher at the time was like the sweetest, most nurturing instructor ever. And when I asked him if he'd seen Whiplash, he told me he started it but couldn't finish it. Bless his soul. My point is, I think the fact that someone in the same professional field as Fletcher couldn't stomach watching his extreme methods speaks volumes as to how repulsive his character makes these scenes. But what's the reasoning behind the madness? What could possibly compel someone to show such little empathy for individuals they supposedly want to succeed? Well, that brings us to checkbox number 2, motivation. To me, this is arguably the most important facet to writing a villain. If you can create an opposing force with genuinely convincing incentives for evil that challenge the protagonist's entire worldview, you've got something special in your hands. This is a bit of a childhood throwback, but a fantastic example is Tai Lung from Kung Fu Panda. He was raised on false promises and dedicated his entire life to something he ultimately would never become. It's no wonder he feels betrayed. You don't necessarily agree with the path he took, but his reasons for evil check out, and he's a believable character as a result. On the contrary, I watched Pocahontas for the first time recently, and man, is my man Ratcliffe one of the worst animated villains period. My guy cares for one thing and one thing only, and that's gold.
An entire new world chock full of gold. When King James sees the gold these peasants unearth, it's the gold! They have it! They've got our gold! 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 Gold!
It goes without saying that bare-bones motives such as Ratcliffe's leaves your characters as one-dimensional without the opportunity for nuance or the ability to be taken seriously in the first place. Thankfully, Fletcher is not that. His motives aren't revealed into the third act, but it can be inferred that he was there at Schaefer to push people beyond what they thought their limits were. Fletcher is allergic to wasted potential and is a firm believer that talent alone is not enough to be one of the greats. He continuously brings up the story of Charlie Parker, but it's never painted with the concept of luck, but extensive and repetitive practice.
He's laughed off stage.
cries himself to sleep that night, but the next morning, what does he do? He practices. And he practices and he practices with one goal in mind: never to be laughed at again.
Fletcher takes the phrase "practice makes perfect" to the next level. He doesn't trust a single individual to be disciplined enough because we'll all reach a limit eventually. He believes the only way to truly be the greatest there is to do what everyone else isn't and break past that limit. It sounds reasonable on paper, but the ride isn't nearly as smooth when you take those words literally. To Fletcher, this means outworking, out-practicing, and out-sacrificing everyone else. Because how can you be number one if there's someone out there that wants it more than you? Their conversation in the jazz club tackles this exact concept with one of the most memorable lines of the picture.
There are no two words in the English language more harmful than good job.
But is there a line? You know, maybe you go too far and you discourage the next Charlie Parker from ever becoming Charlie Parker?
No, man, no. Because the next Charlie Parker would never be discouraged.
Yeah.
He's completely mastered this form of manipulation where he shifts the fault onto you. He gets Andrew under this impression that his emotions should be disregarded as they're just a sign of weakness, that he was never meant to be the next Buddy Rich. So in an attempt to prove him wrong, Andrew pushes himself further and further past his breaking point, giving Fletcher exactly what he wanted. Damien Chazelle ensures that while you might not necessarily agree with Fletcher's stance on artistry, the audience will at least fully understand the guy's madness, leaving the story feeling more grounded and realistic as a result. With the mention of Andrew's broken psyche, I'd like to transition into our final checkbox, that being a connection to the protagonist. All too often, writers will fall into what I like to call the Darth Maul trap, in which you've got this intriguing, brilliantly designed character that's sole use ends up being for a single showdown at the end. My guy has no role in the plot outside of this duel, and thus no connection or influence over the protagonist's journey as a result. What you want to go for is something more along the lines of the Joker from The Dark Knight. He's the one person able to make Batman feel truly powerless, gets him questioning his own moral compass, and literally puts the man in retirement by the end of the film. Fletcher is very similar in the sense that Whiplash's plot literally would not function without him, as essentially every scene is built around him and Neiman's relationship. It's because of this connection that themes are able to be communicated and the discussions surrounding human limits can be facilitated. Fletcher's presence in the narrative allows us to witness this tragic case study of what were to happen if an artist truly made absolute sacrifice in exchange for absolute perfection. We see this abuse not just motivate Neiman, but completely alter his lifestyle and worldview. The poor guy literally becomes convinced that friends and family are holding him back. He stops seeing movies with his dad, he breaks up with his girlfriend, and he says this at dinner.
Got any friends, Andy?
No.
Oh, why's that?
I don't know, I just never really saw the use.
During dinner, it becomes pretty evident that he's adopted Fletcher's elitist mentality, and it's transformed this average Joe into a condescending, pretentious douchebag. His allergy to mediocrity becomes so egregious to the point where he says this with his chest out.
I'd rather die drunk, broke at 34 and have people at a dinner table talk about me than live to be rich and sober at 90 and nobody remember who I was.
Ah, but your friends will remember you. That's the point.
None of us were friends with Charlie Parker. That's the point.
Fletcher's warped Neiman's entire view of his self-worth as not his inner character, his emotional intelligence, or core values, but rather solely his skill as a drummer. This abusive mentorship has stripped Neiman of any value he held for his personal happiness or fulfillment in exchange for total obsession for recognition. While for a fleeting moment he escapes this lifestyle, by the ending, their toxic relationship has been solidified and committed to. In the grand 10-minute rendition of Caravan that is the finale, Andrew finally stands up to Fletcher and gains his respect by taking control of the band. But in doing so, Fletcher still wins. Fletcher never became Charlie Parker himself, nor had a student that ever rose to that caliber, until Andrew. And with this drum solo and a final knowing look between the two, Andrew chooses the life of the broke, drunk, friendless musician whose successes he sacrificed everything for Fletcher will live vicariously through. It's because of the absolute excellence of the writing of his intimidation tactics, philosophy and artistry, and painfully intimate connection with Andrew that Damien Chazelle was able to create such a well-realized evil. Fletcher was able to make such a lasting impression on the audience, not just because of the magnitude of his madness, but because of how efficiently he channeled Whiplash's themes, forcing the viewer to ask themselves where they thought the line of sacrifice was drawn. Anyway, thank you so much to everyone that watched until the end. Y'all are absolutely incredible. Take care, everyone, and I hope you have a fantastic day.